He was rich and cold, his son withdrawn and confined to a wheelchair. But everything changed when a simple black waitress reached out her hand to the boy. What happened next, no one could have predicted. Write in the comments where you're watching from, and be sure to subscribe so you don't miss the next video. The restaurant at the top floor of the Bellevue Plaza shimmered with understated elegance. There were no grand chandeliers, no loud music, no overwhelming colors, only the soft murmur of live jazz and the warm golden hue of lamps glowing against mahogany panels and velvet curtains. Every Friday evening, like clockwork, one of the finest booths near the farthest window was reserved under the name Devereaux. It had become a routine that no one questioned, not the maitre d', not the staff, and certainly not the man who always arrived precisely at 7. Richard Devereaux entered with the quiet command of someone long accustomed to being obeyed. His suit was immaculate, tailored to a degree that even his stillness carried weight. His face, carved from the same stone as his reputation, bore no unnecessary expression. The only softness in his features appeared when he paused at the entrance to wait for the boy trailing silently behind him. Noah, 10 years old, slim-framed, dark-haired, and seated in a motorized wheelchair he had grown into like an extension of himself. His limbs sat stiffly in the chair's well-padded seat, his hands limp over the armrests. He did not speak as his father checked in with a clipped nod. He did not look around at the gleam of polished cutlery or the flicker of candlelight on crystal glasses. His eyes sought something quieter. They turned to the polished wooden floor near the small open space between the tables, a space not designed for performance but open enough for the subtle movements of couples who sometimes swayed to the low hum of the jazz band on weekends. The hostess led them through the restaurant with efficiency, placing 2 menus before them at table 7. Richard nodded once in thanks and took his seat. Noah was wheeled gently into position, close enough to the table but with his usual precision, just far enough to see without craning his neck, just close enough to avoid feeling watched. They rarely spoke during these dinners. Richard saw them as gestures of fatherhood, performed for the sake of routine and memory. The dinners had begun shortly after Noah's mother, Camille, had died 3 years earlier. Camille had been warm, luminous, musical. She had loved these kinds of places with string instruments and low lights, and the faint scent of vanilla folded into linen. Richard brought Noah not to remember Camille, but to honor the form she had cherished. It was the only way he knew how. That night, the waitress assigned to table 7 was a woman named Jada. She approached with the same grace she offered every guest, her tray balanced lightly on one hand, her notepad in the other. Her uniform was crisp, though the hem showed signs of long wear. Her shoes, black and softened by time, barely made a sound on the floor. Her skin was a deep, radiant brown, her eyes thoughtful, her expression attentive without being obtrusive. She had learned the art of quiet presence, how to see and be seen without disrupting the illusion of luxury. She greeted Richard politely, took his order with quiet efficiency, and then turned to the boy. "And for you, sir?" she asked gently, tilting her head in a way that lowered her eyes closer to his level. Noah did not speak. He never did, not with strangers. Richard cleared his throat. "The same as usual." Jada nodded, made a quick note, and left. She had seen boys like Noah before, children who watched more than they spoke, who lived just behind their eyes, quiet and thinking. But something about him struck her. Not pity, not even sympathy. A sense of recognition, perhaps, of silence that wasn't empty. Over the next hour, Jada passed their table several times. She poured wine, cleared plates, and delivered dessert with the same quiet rhythm. But she began to notice a pattern. Every time she passed, Noah's eyes followed her feet. Not her face, not the food, her feet. She began to adjust her movements without meaning to, a shift in weight, a subtle glide, a pause and pivot between tables. And each time as she moved, Noah's fingers twitched against the armrest, barely perceptible gestures, as though trying to echo something long forgotten. On her last round, as she brought the check, Jada let herself do something small and spontaneous. With a ballpoint pen from her apron, she doodled on a fresh napkin. It was nothing elaborate, just a sketch of a stick figure in a wheelchair with a swirl of stars around it. Underneath, she wrote in soft, slanted print, "You move more than you think." She folded the napkin carefully and tucked it beside Noah's plate, saying nothing. When Richard looked up and nodded his thanks for the meal, Jada merely smiled and moved on. Back in the car, Noah said nothing. But when they arrived home and Richard helped him out of the chair, he noticed that the napkin was still on Noah's lap, clutched lightly between his fingers. Richard said nothing. The following week, Friday came again. At table 7, the same scene played out. The soft lights, the gentle music, the precise clatter of silver against porcelain. But when Jada approached this time, her breath caught. Noah was holding the napkin. He had brought it back, flattened, folded neatly. He didn't hand it to her. He just placed it beside his plate and looked at her, not directly, but enough. That was how it began. Week by week, something unspoken passed between them. Jada, without planning, began leaving small gestures for him. A paper crane made from a receipt. A tiny heart traced into the foam of his hot chocolate. A cherry placed atop his napkin like a jewel. And Noah began to respond. One Friday, he handed her a balled-up paper towel. Inside was a child's drawing, 2 stick figures, one in a dress, one in a chair. A music note hovered between them. No words, just that. She understood immediately. Jada never asked questions. She never pressed for stories. She was a woman who had long ago learned that people give what they can when they're ready. At home, she had her own world of silence. A mother whose memory was slipping slowly into shadows. A daughter, Ava, just 6, too young to know why the electricity sometimes blinked off, too young to question why Mama cried alone in the shower. The tips she made barely kept them afloat. But somehow, at table 7 each week, Jada rediscovered something she didn't even realize she'd lost. A beat, a rhythm, a reason to move. She hadn't danced in years. Not since before Ava was born, not since her scholarship in New Orleans evaporated in the chaos of a knee injury, a lost apartment, a man who'd left with more than he gave. But with Noah, no music, no choreography, there was a pulse again. One night, as she passed their table, she gave in to an impulse. There was an upbeat swing to the jazz trio's rendition of Fly Me to the Moon. She stepped lightly, only slightly off the path, a pivot on the ball of her foot, a subtle arm flick, no spectacle, just motion. She didn't look at Noah. She didn't need to. From the corner of her eye, she saw his hand move, not a twitch, but a choice. He lifted one finger and traced a circle in the air. Deliberate, present. Richard noticed. He frowned slightly, glanced at Jada's retreating form, then back at his son. He said nothing. But for the first time in a long time, he wondered if the silence between them wasn't protection, but imprisonment. Jada didn't know why she felt drawn to the boy. It wasn't charity. It wasn't some savior fantasy. It was resonance, recognition. The same way dancers can feel each other's weight and movement, She could feel Noah's emotional gravity. He pulled her toward stillness, and she offered motion in return. It was not a dance, not yet, but something had begun. By the end of the month, the maitre d' had assigned Jada to table 7 permanently, not by request, just instinct. And Jada, without knowing exactly when, began to look forward to Fridays. Not because of tips, not because of the food, because at that table, a boy who hadn't spoken a word in public in 3 years was starting to move again. And somewhere in the quiet, she was too. Friday returned like a quiet heartbeat in the city's chest. The Bellevue Plaza was already humming with the rhythm of candlelight conversations, low laughter, and jazz brushing gently through the warm interior like silk. Outside, the streets remained unaware of what happened at Table 7, what continued to happen week by week beneath the soft murmur of clinking glasses and the slow motion of servers weaving between tables. Inside, Noah Devereaux was clutching something in his lap. Not a toy, not a napkin to wipe his mouth. It was folded precisely, with careful creases running along the sides like ribs. Jada noticed it the moment she approached. Her trained eyes caught the way his small fingers tapped against the edge, not nervously, but purposefully, like he was waiting for the right time to offer it. Richard sat across from his son, flipping absently through his phone, skimming stock updates and flagged emails. He barely registered the object in Noah's lap or the tension in his shoulders. To Richard, this evening was the same as always, another hour to be managed, another ritual to be observed. He nodded at Jada when she arrived and spoke in his clipped, reserved tone. "His usual," he said, glancing at Noah for half a second. "And I'll take the filet mignon, rare. Thank you." Jada smiled politely and turned to Noah. She never skipped him, not even once. Her voice lowered just slightly, not in pity, but to level herself with his quiet. "And for you, sir?" Noah didn't respond. Not with words. But his eyes lifted from his lap, and for the first time since she had known him, they did not dart away. He met her gaze, briefly, then pointedly dropped the folded paper onto the table. Jada hesitated, then reached out slowly as if accepting a gift from a wild bird who might flee at the wrong movement. She unfolded the paper without a word, and what she saw made her catch her breath. It was a child's drawing, done in pencil and smudged in the corners. 2 figures stood side by side beneath a floating swirl of stars. One was seated in a clearly drawn wheelchair. The other stood mid-motion with arms outstretched and one foot lifted, like a dancer mid-step. A music note hovered between them. At the bottom, in shaky block letters, was written, "Together feels easier." Jada blinked. It wasn't perfect, the proportions were wrong, and the faces little more than dots. But it said everything. The drawing didn't need technique, it had truth. When she looked up, Noah was watching her, not with a smile, but with something deeper. Expectation, hope, like he needed to know if she'd understood. She gave a single nod, then carefully folded the paper and tucked it into the pocket of her apron, tapping it gently like a secret kept between 2 people. That evening, her steps felt lighter. Noah, in his way, had spoken. At home that night, Jada laid the drawing on her kitchen table. Her daughter, Ava, was coloring nearby, humming to herself. The apartment was quiet except for the tick of the clock above the fridge and the occasional wheeze of the heater struggling to warm the space. Jada stared at the drawing longer than she expected. It wasn't just a gift. It was a message. An invitation. Noah had opened a door, even if just a crack, and he had opened it for her. She hadn't told anyone about the boy in the chair, not her manager, not the other servers. He was just another customer in their eyes, polite, silent, strange, but to Jada, he had become something else entirely. A rhythm she could feel in her bones, a song only she could hear. She began preparing for Fridays like someone preparing for an audition. Her shoes were polished more carefully, her apron freshly pressed, her movements practiced, fluid. Not performative, never that, but precise, thoughtful. And Noah, for his part, responded. The following week, he brought another drawing. This time it was of a single line that curled like a ribbon across the page. Along the curve were small arrows indicating movement. At the end was a tiny star. Jada didn't need to ask what it meant. It was a path, a journey, a dance. She looked at him, tilting her head slightly, and whispered, "Show me." Noah didn't move then, but something changed in his eyes. A readiness, maybe, or a question. Will you still follow me if I don't know where I'm going? The napkin she left that day was blank, except for a heart in the corner. Nothing more needed to be said. At home, Richard noticed changes in his son, but didn't comment on them. It was too subtle to name. A longer attention span at dinner, a new tendency to grip the arms of his wheelchair instead of letting his hands droop. One evening, Noah even asked for the music to stay on when they returned home. That startled Richard. Noah never asked for anything. "Music?" he had repeated, standing awkwardly in the doorway of the media room. "You want music?" Noah gave a small nod. Richard turned on the stereo without asking further questions. The jazz album played quietly in the background while Noah sat near the window, fingers tapping on the sill like a metronome. He didn't speak, but he didn't need to. On Fridays, the ritual expanded. Jada began leaving him small treasures. Nothing expensive, nothing elaborate. Once, it was a paper crane made from a receipt. Another time, a napkin folded into a lotus. Noah began bringing things too. An origami boat, a sketch of piano keys, a square of cardboard with two stick figures drawn holding hands, labeled simply, "Me plus you." The restaurant became their stage, though no one else saw it. Other servers noticed the attention Jada gave the boy, but they didn't ask questions. They had their own tables, their own lives. As long as the Devereaux name kept tipping well, no one had reason to interfere. But someone did notice, if only in flashes. One evening, Richard caught a glimpse of Jada moving past their table with a motion that was unmistakably rhythmic. A half turn of her shoulder, a sweep of her hand. He frowned, watching as Noah's eyes followed her like gravity. "She's spirited," he commented aloud, more to himself than anyone else. Noah made a small sound. It wasn't quite a laugh, not quite a word, but it was something. Richard paused, then shook his head. Perhaps he was imagining it. Perhaps he was just tired. He did not know that Noah had begun to speak in other places. To his nurse he had whispered, "Jada." To his physical therapist he had asked once, "Dance?" And at night, in the dark, he sometimes hummed along to the songs she had passed through the air with her body. Jada never asked about his medical condition. She didn't ask why he was in the chair or what doctors said. It didn't matter to her. What mattered was that he moved. One afternoon, while closing out her shift, she lingered at table 7 long after Richard and Noah had gone. She wiped the surface slowly, as if removing dust from a mirror. In her apron pocket, the drawings rested gently against her chest. She thought about the way Noah's eyes had lit up that evening. Not dramatically, not like a child at Christmas, but with something quieter. Recognition. As though, for the first time in a long time, someone had not only seen him, but chosen to stay. Her daughter Ava ran up to her as she unlocked their door later that night. Mama, guess what I drew?" Jada smiled, crouching down. What, baby? A ballerina, like you. She has a dress and she's spinning. Jada kissed her forehead. You remembered? I remember everything, Ava said solemnly. Even your dancing shoes. You should dance again. The words echoed later when the apartment was dark, and Ava had fallen asleep curled against her side. You should dance again. She had forgotten what it felt like to move without pain. Not physical pain, emotional. The weight of failure, of lost dreams, of dreams deferred. But now, in the quiet, she began to wonder. If a boy who could barely walk had the courage to begin again, what was stopping her? The next Friday, she brought something new. Not a drawing, not a napkin, just her presence. When Noah looked at her, she turned her wrist gently, once, twice, like a silent signature. And Noah, for the first time, smiled. The room didn't notice. But something had changed. It began, as all things do, with a drawing. A single pencil sketch on a folded sheet of paper. But what it had drawn was more than a picture. It was a bridge, and they had started to cross. It had become a ritual now, though not one spoken of or formally acknowledged. Each Friday evening arrived with quiet expectation, not just from Jada or from Noah, but from the space itself. Table 7, now quietly marked by a history no one else understood. The staff had stopped rotating servers there. Even the maitre d' no longer pretended it was coincidental that Jada always served the Devereaux party. It simply was. Noah was different now, in small ways. His eyes lifted more often. He no longer sat in a droop of passivity, but carried a strange alertness that shimmered like heat over a highway. At school, his aides noted it in passing. His therapists recorded better postural control. His nurse whispered it to herself when she noticed the line of his mouth curve ever so slightly as music played. And at home, Richard, despite himself, began to sense something he could not yet name. Jada noticed it the moment she approached their table that Friday evening. It was in the way Noah's hand tapped lightly against the edge of his tray, in the way his shoulders sat less sunken beneath the weight of silence. There was something alive in him, like breath held too long finally being released. She greeted them as usual, her voice warm and without formality. Richard gave her the smallest of nods, and Jada turned to Noah, letting her tone lower to that private register she reserved only for him. And for you? Noah didn't respond right away, but then, slowly, he turned his head and looked at her, not just with his eyes, but fully, with the whole presence of a child who had decided to be present in the world again. His lips parted slightly. His throat moved. Music, he said. The word was a whisper, a syllable barely given breath, but it hung in the air like incense, fragrant and holy. Jada froze, and her eyes widened, not in surprise but in awe. She knelt slightly beside him, bringing herself to his level as she always did. Music? She repeated softly, as if afraid to break the moment. Noah nodded. It was the first time she had heard his voice. Richard looked up from his phone, startled by the sound, and then narrowed his eyes. Did he speak? Jada didn't answer right away. She simply smiled and rose to her feet. I'll ask the band for something he likes, she said. She didn't elaborate. She didn't praise him or draw attention. She simply moved, and Noah's gaze followed her like it always did, but now with something new layered beneath. Trust. When she returned later with a fresh lemonade and a slight sway in her step, the trio had shifted into a mellow instrumental. The piano keys fell like warm rain, and the upright bass throbbed with gentle steadiness. Noah listened, and then his hand moved, Not spasmodically, not reflexively, but in rhythm. He tapped once, twice, and then paused. Then again. Jada passed him, her steps matching the beat. She let her movements loosen just a little more that night, allowing the music to animate her hips and shoulders with the grace that once defined her. It wasn't a performance, it was a dialogue. Noah's hand twitched in time with her steps, and his head tilted almost imperceptibly, as though following the arc of her spine through the room. The other guests didn't notice. They were too busy with their own worlds, their own plates, their own glassed-in lives. But for Jada and Noah, the world had narrowed to the width of that polished floor and the space between a woman's steps and a boy's silent tempo. When she brought their check, he surprised her again. "Thank you," he said. 2 words, crisp and small, but they hit Jada like thunder. This time, Richard heard it clearly. He looked up, startled once more. His brow furrowed and he leaned forward, peering at his son as if discovering something alien. He didn't say anything. He simply watched. On the way home, Richard drove in silence. The car was quiet, save for the engine's hum and the occasional breath of traffic outside the window. Noah sat in the passenger seat, his fingers still tapping on his thigh as if echoing a beat only he could hear. At a red light, Richard turned toward his son. The boy was staring out the window, but not blankly. His eyes were moving, tracing the lights, the shadows, the shapes of passing cars. "You spoke tonight," Richard said. Noah didn't answer. Richard's grip tightened on the steering wheel. "You said music and thank you. That's the first time you've spoken in public since—" He stopped himself. "Since Camille died." The sentence hung unspoken between them. Noah turned slightly but didn't speak again. Richard wanted to press. He wanted to say more. But he didn't know how to ask without sounding like he was demanding answers. So he remained quiet. At home, in the silence of his study, Richard sat with a glass of scotch he didn't really want. He turned over the memory again and again. The softness of his son's voice, the way his eyes had followed that woman's steps. Not just looked, followed. Jada. He knew her name now. He had never cared to before, but tonight it seemed important. Necessary. That woman had done something in a matter of weeks that no doctor, therapist, or specialist had managed in 3 years. She had made his son want to speak again. The following Friday, Jada came with something in her hand, a folded paper napkin with another sketch, this one more elaborate. It was a path made of music notes, winding like a river between 2 cliffs. At the center stood 2 stick figures, arms raised like dancers reaching for the sky. One of them wore a crown of stars. She placed it beside Noah's plate without a word. When he saw it, he smiled. Not broadly, just enough. And then, as the music began again, he did something that made her heart stop. He lifted his hand toward her, palm up, fingers open. It was not a plea, not a command, just an invitation. Jada stood there, motionless, and for a moment she felt the world tilt. She was no longer a server in a restaurant. She was something else, a presence in someone's rediscovery, a mirror to a soul awakening. She didn't take his hand, not yet, not in front of everyone, but she nodded. And then she mirrored his movement, lifted her hand, palm open, and held it at chest height. Their hands hung in the air like twin questions, each waiting for an answer. The music carried them through that moment. The people around them went on eating, talking, laughing, but Jada and Noah existed in a different rhythm, one marked by silence and breath and the stretch between gestures. Later that night, Noah surprised everyone. His nurse, while brushing his teeth, heard him humming, just a few bars. Just enough. At school, when asked if he needed help with his worksheet, he responded aloud, "No." At dinner on Wednesday, he asked his father in the quietest voice, "What's for dessert?" Richard dropped his fork. He didn't mention it the next day. He didn't dare. He was afraid to jinx it, afraid that naming the miracle might undo it. But on Friday, when he stepped into the restaurant with his son beside him, he paused at the entrance. Not for appearances, not for show, but because for the first time he wondered if he was about to witness something sacred. And he was. Jada met them at the table with her usual grace, and Noah, with no prompting, whispered, "Hi." She didn't cry, she didn't gasp, she just smiled and said, "Hi." Later that night, as she closed her shift and the last guest trickled out into the cold night air, she leaned against the service counter and stared at the empty table. He was coming back to life. Not because she had saved him, but because she had seen him. And in that silence, Noah had begun to speak. By early March, the snow on the city sidewalks had receded into grimy slush, and spring leaned cautiously around the corners of alleyways and shop fronts. It hadn't yet taken hold, but it was there, and a hint of softness in the air, and the longer reach of sunlight across the sidewalks. Inside the Bellevue Plaza restaurant, the season was felt only in the flowers placed weekly near the entryway, and in the gentle shift of the live trio's repertoire from slow winter ballads to brighter, swinging rhythms. On one such Friday, Noah arrived earlier than usual. It had been his suggestion, or rather his insistence, quiet but firm. For the first time in months, he had used his voice in the car, his speech still delicate and soft, but clear enough to be unmistakable. "Early," he had said. Richard had glanced at him, startled. He didn't argue. He simply altered their schedule without comment, though his hands tightened on the wheel with the tension of one who didn't quite understand what had changed, only that something had. Jada noticed their early arrival immediately. She was setting down fresh menus when she saw them approach. Noah sat straighter in his chair than she had ever seen, and his eyes were already scanning the space, not with anxiety but with purpose. She smiled as she reached their table. "You're early today." Noah's response was measured. "Wanted music." Richard opened his mouth as if to interject, but the words didn't come. He simply looked between his son and the waitress, and for once he allowed the silence to speak. The jazz trio wasn't yet on stage, but music played softly through the restaurant's hidden speakers. A mellow, brushed percussion loop paired with piano keys like drops of rain. The tempo was calm, casual, but Noah began tapping his finger along the armrest of his chair with a precision that startled even Jada. 1, 2, 3, pause. 1, 2, 3, pause. She noticed his feet, too. The left one moved slightly, barely a nudge, but deliberate, controlled. "Noah," she said, crouching beside him, "are you dancing?" He didn't answer, but he tapped again. This time his whole hand moved, not just the fingers. A broader arc, like a conductor's baton slicing through water. Behind her, one of the newer servers leaned against the bar and watched with vague curiosity. "What's he doing?" he muttered. Jada didn't answer him. She didn't have to. Noah was doing something extraordinary. He was moving to the beat, not erratically, not reflexively, with purpose. And he wasn't just keeping time. He was leading it. When the trio finally took the stage, slightly ahead of schedule, they started with a breezy swing tune, something between Ellington and Brubeck, light on brass but sharp on piano. And in the third measure, something happened. Noah leaned forward. It was a small thing. His upper body inclined, his hand lifted, but Jada recognized it for what it was. A cue, a signal. She'd seen it hundreds of times in rehearsal studios, from choreographers and dancers and musicians alike. It was a gesture that didn't ask but declared, "Follow me." She moved instantly. Her shift faded from her mind. The restaurant noise blurred, and all she saw was the rhythm Noah offered like a thread between them. Jada took 2 steps across the floor. Not large, not sweeping, just enough to feel the downbeat, and when she turned on the ball of her foot, Noah tapped in time. 1, 2, 3. Pause. 1, 2, shift. They moved together, though separated by distance. He in his chair, she on the floor. He conducted, she answered. And in those shared beats, they became something neither of them had ever known. A duo, a pair not united by perfection, but by timing. Trust. The other diners didn't fully understand what they were watching. Some looked up from their plates. A woman at a nearby table smiled softly. A child clapped in time until his mother hushed him, but no one interrupted. Even Richard remained still. Noah's eyes never left Jada's feet. He watched her pivot, watched her heels slide across the floor, and each time she turned or dipped her head, his hands caught the echo of her motion, shaping it in air. She passed their table again and stopped just long enough to say, "You've got the beat in you, don't you?" Noah whispered, "Always." And she believed him. That night, something changed in the boy. He was no longer just responding to rhythm. He was building it. In the following weeks, Jada noticed the pattern continue. Each Friday, Noah brought a new drawing, but they had shifted. Gone were the quiet stick figures. Now they were filled with motion. Arcs, arrows, notations, sometimes even simple music bars with notes unevenly placed. One sketch showed feet, her feet, she assumed, with curved lines drawn around them like waves. Another showed 2 wheels trailing behind a line of footprints. "Which one are you?" she asked once, holding up the page. He tapped both, then pointed to a shape in the corner, a shaded heart. She understood. It wasn't about who followed and who led anymore. It was about dancing together. At school, Noah shocked his teachers when he tapped a rhythm during a music lesson, then said aloud, "Too slow." When they called Richard to report the progress, the man sat silent on the phone. Then he simply said, "Thank you," and ended the call. He didn't understand where it had come from, but he knew, without any doubt, it had something to do with her. At home, Richard sat in the den late at night, playing old records he hadn't touched since his wife died. Camille had loved music, jazz mostly, but she'd also dabbled in flamenco, in West African drumming, in any sound that pulsed with heartbeat. He thought of her when he watched Noah now, not the way she died, but the way she lived, fully, loudly, without fear of being offbeat. And their son, so long withdrawn into silence and stillness, was now vibrating with rhythm. One evening, Richard did something he hadn't done in years. He took Noah outside after dinner into the backyard and brought a portable speaker with him. He played the same trio they heard at the restaurant, just piano and drums. Then he said, awkwardly, "I don't know how to dance, kiddo, but if you've got moves to teach me, I'm listening." Noah didn't speak, but he tapped. 1, 2, 3. Pause. And Richard, clumsy and stiff, followed. The next Friday at the Bellevue, something even more remarkable occurred. As Jada approached table 7 with a pitcher of water, Noah did not wait for her to speak. He looked directly at her and said, "Will you dance again?" She blinked, stunned. "What?" Noah nodded. "Dance, like you used to." She hadn't told him, not directly, but somehow he knew. Perhaps he had seen it in the way she moved, in the grace she tried to hide, in the music that poured from her without thinking. She sat beside him, something she had never done before, and whispered, "Maybe I will." Noah smiled, and for the first time, she believed it too. At home that night, Jada pulled out a box from the back of her closet. Inside were her old ballet flats, scuffed and broken but still wearable. Her leotard, faded. A notebook filled with choreography from her college days, handwritten and smudged by years of forgetting. She stood in the narrow kitchen, waited until Ava fell asleep, and turned on a metronome on her phone. Then she danced. Slowly at first, each motion rusty and tight, but by the fifth step, her body remembered. And somewhere in another part of the city, Noah tapped in time, without music, without knowing why, his hand brushing against the rhythm of something bigger than himself. They were no longer just two lives intersecting by accident. They were partners. And the boy with the beat had finally found someone who could hear him. The sky over the city had shifted to a cooler blue as April settled in, spreading its softer light across rooftops and slow-moving traffic. In the mornings, the breeze smelled faintly of wet stone and thawed earth, and by late afternoon, there were children on the sidewalks again, some with jackets tied around their waists, others already daring shorts and scraped knees. It was a kind of spring that didn't announce itself with blossoms, but with the quiet return of movement. Inside the Devereaux residence, movement had also returned, but not in the ways Richard had once imagined. Noah no longer sat idle during the long hours after school. He no longer stared blankly at the television or waited passively for the next therapy session. He asked for music, sometimes by name. He drew constantly, sketches of shoes, of spirals, of dancers mid-motion. And he tapped. Always, he tapped. Against furniture, his wheelchair armrest and the glass of the dining room window. His fingers had become instruments and rhythm had turned into language. Richard watched this evolution with a mix of awe and confusion. He didn't know how to respond to it. It was like watching a foreign film without subtitles. He could see that something meaningful was happening, but the meaning itself eluded him. One Thursday evening, he lingered outside Noah's room longer than usual. The door was ajar, and inside, he could hear soft music playing from the small speaker on the desk. Jazz again. Nothing aggressive, just a brushed cymbal and lazy piano. Noah sat at his desk with his back straight and his sketchbook open in front of him. He wasn't drawing this time. He was writing. Richard stepped forward, gently pushing the door wider. "Homework?" he asked, his voice quieter than usual. Noah didn't answer right away. Then he looked up and gave a single shake of his head. "Letters," he said. Richard entered the room fully, unsure what to make of the answer. He walked slowly, taking in the neatness of the desk, the careful arrangement of colored pencils, the absence of the machines and monitors that used to dominate the space. He stopped beside the boy. "Letters to who?" Noah didn't look up. "To Jada." Richard felt something flicker inside his chest, not resentment exactly, but a dull tightness he hadn't expected. He swallowed it quickly. "What do you write?" Noah hesitated. Then he whispered, "Things I can't say." Richard stood there for a long moment, unsure what to do with that. He left the room without asking more. The next day, he arrived at the restaurant before Noah. For once, he wasn't rushing in at the last minute or distracted by a call. He walked in with deliberate pace, asked the host for table 7, and stood waiting in silence. When Jada appeared from the back, she saw him first. She registered the tension in his shoulders before anything else. He wasn't wearing the polished armor of his usual presence. Today, he looked exposed. "Mr. Devereaux," she said politely. "Noah's not." "I know." Richard interrupted. "He'll be here in 20 minutes. He wanted to pick something up from the bookstore." Jada nodded, folding her hands in front of her apron. "Can I get you anything while you wait?" "Just water," he said. She returned quickly and set the glass down. He didn't reach for it. "May I ask you something?" he said, voice low. Jada nodded. "Why him?" The question was raw. It wasn't accusatory, but it was full of something deeper, something weary. She took a breath, studying the man across from her, the stiffness in his jaw, the effort it took him to even ask. "You mean, why do I care?" she asked gently. He nodded. She thought for a moment, then sat across from him. Not something she'd ever done in her role, but somehow it felt necessary. The restaurant around them hummed softly, but no one paid them any mind. "Because he listens," she said simply. Richard looked confused. "I don't mean just to sound or words," she added. "I mean to what's beneath them. Noah hears the space between things, and that's rare." Richard sat back, stunned by the clarity of her answer. He looked down at the table, his fingers pressing into the wood. "I thought I was helping him," he admitted. "All these years, protecting, organizing, planning every hour. But I think I've been filling the silence with my voice so much, I never realized I was drowning his." Jada said nothing. She let the silence settle, and for the first time in a long time, Richard didn't rush to fill it. When Noah arrived, his sketchbook on his lap, he paused at the sight of his father sitting alone at the table with Jada. His eyes darted from one to the other, uncertain. Richard stood and moved his son's chair into place without a word. Then he sat beside him and asked, "You brought something?" Noah nodded. "Can I see?" It was the first time he had asked, not ordered, not instructed, just asked. Noah looked at Jada, then back at his father. Slowly, he opened the sketchbook. Inside was a drawing unlike any Richard had ever seen from him. It wasn't just figures or notes or motion. It was of 3 figures, one seated, one standing, and one somewhere in between, their hands extended toward one another like bridges. At the top, in Noah's wobbly, careful handwriting, were the words, "This is the rhythm." Richard stared at it for a long time. He felt something ache in his chest, not pain, not grief, something softer, regret maybe, and wonder. Noah looked to Jada. "You'll dance?" It wasn't a question, it was an offer, and Jada, her throat tight, nodded. "I will." The night unfolded with slow grace. Noah led again, not with grand gestures, but with presence, with rhythm, with breath. And this time, Richard didn't just watch, he listened. He saw the beat he had missed all those years, the one that pulsed beneath his son's stillness, the one that only surfaced when someone finally matched his pace instead of forcing their own. Later that night, Richard stood at the window in his home, drink untouched in his hand, and watched the sky for a long time. He thought about all the times he had mistaken silence for absence, stillness for resignation. He thought about the word Noah had used, rhythm. And for the first time he understood that some rhythms were not meant to be led, but followed. The first true day of spring arrived not with fanfare, but with warmth that clung to the sidewalks long after the sun had slipped behind the skyline. The air was soft, full of faint blooming things and a promise that had hung in the background for months. It was the kind of day that invited windows to be opened, jackets to be forgotten, and breath to be held just a little longer. It was also the day when Noah Devereaux, age 10, rolled himself into the community center at the edge of Lincoln Park and asked to sign up for the open movement workshop. Jada was already there. She had begun volunteering on Saturdays after closing her double shift at the restaurant Friday nights, giving up her one guaranteed day of rest to work with the children who came, some with braces, others with walkers or wheelchairs, some with nothing visible at all but carrying invisible weights. It wasn't about teaching them to dance in the traditional sense. It was about offering space, rhythm, a little chaos, and a lot of music. It was about letting their bodies speak in whatever language they knew best. Noah had not told her he was coming. She noticed him just as the small speaker in the corner started playing a slow beat layered with hand drums. He was near the entrance, watching the other children intently. There was a boy spinning in circles, eyes closed. A girl with crutches was moving side to side to her own private beat. No choreography, no rules, just raw, honest movement. And Noah, with his sketchbook on his lap and his hands folded carefully, was not there to watch. He was waiting to join. Jada walked to him, her chest tight with something close to joy. "You came," she said. Noah looked up at her. His face was calm, steady. "You said you would dance again." She smiled and held out her hand. "Then let's dance." They didn't take the center of the floor. That wasn't the point. Noah rolled to the edge, near the line of mirrors that stretched across one wall, and began moving his hands to the beat. Not tapping this time, drawing in the air. He carved shapes with his arms, forming invisible lines, curves that only his body could understand. Jada matched him step for step, mirroring his hands with her own feet, moving softly across the floor as though sketching his rhythm into the hardwood itself. Other children noticed. They didn't stop, didn't stare. They just adjusted, made space, flowed around him. This wasn't about admiration. It was about belonging. From the far side of the room, a woman with a clipboard whispered to one of the assistants. "Who's the boy?" The assistant glanced up. "New. That's Noah, Jada's friend." The woman kept watching. Her name was Miranda Feld, and she was the director of a regional adaptive arts foundation. She came twice a year to observe. Mostly, she left early, but not today. For nearly an hour, Noah and Jada moved together. He in his chair, arms sweeping in wide arcs, shoulders shifting to the rhythm. She glided around him like water, catching each pause, answering every motion with one of her own. It was not rehearsed. It was not even deliberate. It simply was. They had become a conversation. And then, in a moment that neither of them expected, Noah raised his voice above the music and said, "Can we show them?" Jada paused. "Show them what?" Noah looked down at his lap, then opened the sketchbook. Inside was a spread she hadn't seen before. 8 pages taped together to form one wide mural. It was choreography, but not in any formal sense. There were no 8 counts, no rigid notations. There were spirals, lines, dots, arrows that curved. And at the center, a symbol she recognized immediately. 2 open palms drawn in charcoal. "This is ours," he said. Jada nodded, something rising in her throat. "Okay." They didn't announce it. They didn't ask for attention. Jada simply nodded to the assistant in the corner, who faded the music down for a moment and switched the track to something slower, more fluid. A cello, this time, layered with a deep, earthy drum. The room quieted. Noah rolled forward, not to the center, but to a space he seemed to have chosen long ago. Jada followed. And they danced. What they performed wasn't polished. It wasn't clean or precise, but it was real. Noah's hands cut through the air like wings, his torso rising and falling in time with her steps. Jada circled him, letting his tempo guide her, letting her feet respond not to the music, but to the rhythm he made with every motion. And the others, children and volunteers alike, watched with a kind of stillness that only truth can summon. When they finished, there was no applause, only breath. Then someone clapped, then another. But Jada wasn't listening. She was looking at Noah, who sat, cheeks flushed, eyes shining. "You led," she whispered. He smiled. "You followed." Afterward, Miranda Feld approached. "I'd like to talk with you both," she said, "about something more formal, something that travels." Richard received the news that evening while setting the table for dinner. Noah rolled into the dining room and said, "I want to perform." Richard blinked. "Perform? A duet with Jada?" The words were clear, steady. Richard set down the plate. "Like, on stage?" Noah nodded. "She said yes. We've been practicing." Richard had no idea who she was at first until Noah added, "Miranda Feld. She runs the Movement Foundation." It was not a question. It was a statement of intent. For a moment, Richard didn't know what to say. A fork in his hand felt too heavy. Then he asked carefully, "Do you want me to be there?" Noah hesitated, then nodded. "But I don't want you to manage it. Just watch." Richard laughed, almost breathless. "That I can do." The weeks that followed passed in a blur of rehearsals, fittings, and moments that Richard could only watch from the edge. He didn't interfere. He didn't offer suggestions. He simply came, stood in the back of the room while Noah and Jada moved through their piece again and again, building it not out of choreography, but from something deeper. It was a story, a rhythm, a bond. Jada returned to movement like it was home. Not the spotlight, not the prestige, just the joy of it. The muscles waking again, the balance between giving and listening. And Noah grew. Not just taller or more confident, but broader, fuller, his voice steadier, his gaze brighter. He no longer seemed like a boy with a condition. He seemed like a boy with purpose. On the night of the performance, the auditorium was full. Not packed, but full in the way that mattered. Rows of people leaning forward, not back. Waiting, not idly watching. There were children from the center, neighbors, a few curious donors. And in the center of the fourth row, Richard sat alone, his hands folded tight in his lap. The lights dimmed, the music began, and Noah rolled out onto the stage. He wore black slacks and a button-down shirt, his wheelchair gleaming, polished. Jada followed in soft shoes and a flowing tunic. She didn't take his hand. She didn't prompt him. He began. He moved with strength now. Not perfect coordination, but undeniable command. His arms cut through the air with grace, and his torso shifted in powerful, deliberate ways. Jada answered each motion, her body rising and falling in the rhythm he created. They moved in silence, in music, in breath. And, at the end, Noah lifted one hand toward her. She took it. The audience was silent. Then, quietly at first, applause. Richard stood, not out of habit, not out of pride, but because something inside him rose and wouldn't let him sit. His son had become more than he ever imagined. And it had begun not with therapy, not with treatment, but with someone who dared to follow. That night, as they left the auditorium and Noah accepted quiet congratulations from strangers and friends alike, he turned to Jada. "Next time," he said, "you lead." And Jada laughed, tears bright in her eyes. "Only if you promise to follow." It had been a full year since the spring night that changed everything. A full cycle of seasons, of measured school weeks, of performances in rec centers and black box theaters, of interviews for local papers and awkward questions answered with poise. A year of doors opening that none of them, neither Jada nor Richard nor even Noah himself, had expected. But it wasn't the applause or invitations that lingered. It was a way Noah had changed, not just in posture or voice or confidence, but in presence. He occupied space now. He took the lead and offered it to others. He'd stopped trying to fold himself small enough to go unnoticed, and instead had grown into something neither of them had language for, but both recognized as whole. The city had softened again with spring, the sidewalks warm beneath thin soles, and even the smell of roasted chestnuts and street vendors' tacos had returned to the air. At Bellevue Plaza, the trio played earlier now, beginning their sets before the dinner rush and lingering after the last dessert plate had been cleared. And Noah, now 11, still insisted on sitting at table 7, close to the band, close to the quiet hum of rhythm. Jada was no longer just a waitress. That part had ended months ago, when Miranda's foundation had offered her a full-time position coordinating movement residencies in city schools. Her new role paid better, gave her weekends off, and came with its own battles of bureaucracy and budget, but also with moments that made her pause in the middle of an ordinary day and remember why she'd said yes in the first place. Still, on Fridays, she returned to Bellevue, not as staff, not as dancer, but as something else, something Noah had named: family. Richard now arrived at the restaurant before either of them, always 10 minutes early, always with a reservation made under Devereaux. He no longer arrived with his phone in hand or distracted with half a conversation in his ear. He came to sit, to listen, to learn what kind of week Noah had had, not from reports or therapists, but from Noah himself, who spoke openly now about what he loved, what bothered him, and what he wanted to try next. This particular Friday had been circled on the calendar for weeks. It wasn't a birthday, not an anniversary. It was the anniversary, the quiet one. 1 year since the night Noah had asked Jada to dance and change the gravity in all their lives. 1 year since Richard had stopped speaking for his son and started listening instead. 1 year since Jada had stopped hiding her past and let movement become something holy again. Jada arrived last. She entered wearing a pale yellow blouse and soft navy slacks, her hair twisted into a loose bun. She no longer wore black. She no longer tried to blend into a room. And when she walked in, it wasn't the hostess who guided her to table 7. It was Richard. He stood, greeting her with a nod, then pulled back her chair. It was a quiet ritual now, one that spoke more than it appeared to on the surface. Noah was already seated. He had grown taller, his arms leaner, his eyes sharper. The wheelchair was the same, but the way he sat in it had changed. It no longer seemed like something that confined him. It was part of his language, part of how he moved through the world with precision. He wore a blazer tonight. Navy, with a single silver pin on the lapel, a pair of hands in motion, shaped like open wings. It had been a gift from Jada 3 months ago, a quiet nod to everything he'd given her. "Special night," Noah said, matter of fact, as they unfolded their menus. Richard smiled. Indeed. They ordered without much fanfare. Noah chose pasta with lemon cream. Richard, the grilled trout. Jada asked for the same risotto she'd served hundreds of times before, now plated for her like she'd never once carried it on a tray. The music began midway through their meal. The same trio. The same slow jazz that had once made Noah flinch with discomfort. Now he tapped his thumb on the edge of his plate in perfect time. Halfway through dessert, chocolate mousse for Noah, espresso for Richard, tea for Jada, Noah set down his spoon. "I want to ask something." Jada tilted her head. "Go ahead." He looked at both of them. You know how people always say blood makes a family? Neither of them answered. They knew better than to rush. I think rhythm does, he said. Or maybe choosing. Richard's throat tightened, but he said nothing. I choose you, Noah added, looking at Jada. If that's okay. Jada blinked, her lips parting as if to speak, then closing again. She reached across the table and placed her hand over his. It's more than okay, she said quietly. I choose you, too. They sat like that for a long moment, Richard's hands folded on the table, his son's hand beneath Jada's, the space between them humming not with music, but with presence, with choice. Later, as the trio played a soft ballad and the restaurant lights dimmed, Richard asked a question that had been on his mind for months. Do you miss it? Jada looked at him. Miss what? Dancing, on stage, that world. She considered her answer. Sometimes, but I think I was meant to dance here. She gestured lightly. At the table, the room, the two of them. Not every stage has a spotlight. Noah smiled. Some have risotto. They laughed, not loudly, but honestly. The kind of laughter that builds on history, not jokes. The kind that feels earned. When they stepped outside, the city was still warm. The breeze moved gently around them as they paused on the sidewalk, not ready to part. Noah looked up at the night sky. I think we're in time now, he said softly. Neither of them asked what he meant. They didn't need to. They knew. Because in the end, rhythm was never about perfection. It was about movement, about trust, about stepping when someone else stepped and holding still when they needed space. It was about listening more than leading. It was about a boy in a wheelchair who found his beat, a woman who remembered how to move, and a man who finally learned to follow. That night, for the first time, the reservation wasn't just for two. It was a table for three, and the music played on. If this story moved you, don't forget to subscribe for more. Watch the next video to continue the journey and share this one with someone who needs to hear it. Thank you for watching.